The economy. The symbiotic, no, the simp-biotic relationship between simp and baddie destroyed. Things are so bad that simps can't even afford to send hundreds of dollars to a baddie for being a baddie anymore. They can't afford it anymore. They gotta pay for groceries and freaking gas. They gotta pay for groceries and gas. And it's not even the right kind of gas. You can't even buy baddie farts. I don't think I've ever seen anything so bad. This is sad right now. It's so sad.
There's a quiet shift happening in the world right now, and most people are only beginning to notice it when the noise stops. What happens when an entire system that people depended on for decades suddenly runs out of fuel? What happens when expectations collide with reality and there is no one left willing to play along? Stay with me until the end of this video, because what we are witnessing right now is not a trend, not a phase, and not something that can be reversed with slogans or demands. Before we get into it, make sure you like the video, share it with people who need to hear this message, subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell, and select all if you want more great Angry Guy content and want every single video the moment we release it. If you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth, make sure you check out Angry's Crypto Academy, where you can learn how to buy, sell, and trade crypto the smart way. The Academy is linked in the description of this video, so go check it out now. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show your support, you can always buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It helps keep the lights on and the content coming. Now let us talk about what is really going on, because the surface level explanations being pushed right now do not tell the full story. What we are seeing is the collapse of an informal economic system that existed for decades, one that many people did not even realize they were participating in until it stopped working. This system was built on expectations, social pressure, emotional leverage, and financial habits that were never meant to be sustainable. For a long time, many men were conditioned to believe that their role was to give, provide, spend, and sacrifice, without asking serious questions about the long-term outcome. That conditioning did not come from biology alone. It came from culture, media, institutions, and constant reinforcement. For years, men were told that their value was directly tied to what they could offer, how much they could spend, and how much discomfort they were willing to tolerate in silence. Spending money on dates was framed as the bare minimum. Providing emotional labor was framed as basic decency. Absorbing criticism without response was framed as maturity. Over time, many men noticed something important. The expectations kept increasing, but the returns kept shrinking. The more they gave, the less appreciation they received, and the more demands were placed on them. At the same time, social messaging shifted in a way that created constant contradiction. Men were told they were essential and unnecessary at the same time. They were told to be confident but not assertive, present but not visible, strong but not firm, supportive but not directional. Any misstep could be reframed as a character flaw. Many men internalized this pressure and kept going anyway, because that was what they were taught to do. But pressure builds, and systems break when stress exceeds structure. Over the last few years, something changed. Men started stepping back, not loudly, not with protests or announcements, but quietly. They stopped initiating, they stopped chasing, they stopped spending, they stopped explaining themselves. They began choosing peace over approval. They began choosing stability over validation. They began realizing that being alone is not the same thing as being unhappy. For many men, solitude brought clarity, and clarity brought relief. This is where the panic begins, because systems that depend on constant input fail quickly when participation drops. Many people had structured their lives around assumptions that no longer hold. Rising living costs, economic pressure, and social instability have exposed how fragile those assumptions really were. When discretionary spending disappears, when gifts disappear, when attention disappears, the reality sets in fast. What was once taken for granted now feels like a loss, even though it was never guaranteed. You can see the shift reflected across social media platforms, where more and more people openly express frustration, confusion, and anxiety about changing relationship dynamics. There are videos asking why dating feels impossible now. There are posts questioning why traditional expectations are no longer being met. There are conversations about independence colliding with economic reality. What is rarely acknowledged is that this outcome did not appear overnight. It was built gradually, decision by decision, message by message, incentive by incentive. For decades, many men were told directly and indirectly that they were replaceable, unnecessary, or inherently problematic. Masculine traits were reframed as flaws instead of strengths. Boundaries were framed as control. Standards were framed as entitlement. Over time, this messaging did not inspire men to improve, it inspired them to disengage. When people feel constantly judged and undervalued, withdrawal becomes a rational response. At the same time, social systems rewarded short term gratification over long term commitment. Hookup culture was normalized, while stability was framed as boring or restrictive. Responsibility was postponed, while freedom was celebrated without discussion of cost. When people reach their late 20s or early 30s and look around expecting the world to stabilize for them, many are shocked to find that stability requires deliberate choices made earlier, not slogans repeated later. Men began noticing patterns that did not align with what they were told. They noticed that honesty was often punished while performance was rewarded. They noticed that consistency was rarely valued compared to novelty. They noticed that effort did not guarantee respect. Over time, many men stopped listening to what they were told they should want and started paying attention to outcomes instead. Pattern recognition replaced promises, observation replaced ideology. This shift has led to what we now call men walking away. Not walking away from responsibility, but walking away from dynamics that no longer make sense. Walking away from systems where risk is high and reward is uncertain. Walking away from expectations that require constant output with little return. Walking away from narratives that demand sacrifice without reciprocity. For many men, this is not bitterness, it is pragmatism. As men stepped back, they redirected their energy. Some focused on careers, some focused on health, some focused on hobbies, travel, or personal development. Others simply embraced a quieter, more minimalist lifestyle. Without the constant pressure to perform socially, many men discovered how little they actually need to be content. Peace replaced chaos. Predictability replaced volatility. Financial stability replaced constant drain. This is where the disconnect becomes visible. When one side adjusts behavior based on incentives and outcomes, and the other side continues operating on outdated expectations, friction is inevitable. Demands increase when supply drops. Frustration rises when control fades. Instead of reflection, many respond with blame. Instead of adaptation, they call for restoration of a system that no longer functions. It is important to be clear here. It's not about hostility, it is about consequence. Social systems are shaped by incentives, not intentions. When incentives change, behavior follows. Men did not disappear because they were told to. They disappeared because the cost benefit analysis no longer made sense. When effort consistently leads to stress, loss, and criticism, withdrawal is a rational choice. The most striking thing about this moment is how openly people now express disbelief that men are not returning. There is an assumption that disengagement is temporary, that pressure or messaging can reverse it. But disengagement is often permanent once peace is found. Once someone experiences a life with fewer obligations, fewer conflicts, and more control over their time and resources, convincing them to re enter chaos becomes extremely difficult. Economic pressure has accelerated this reality. Inflation has changed the math. Living costs have increased. Discretionary income has shrunk. When money becomes tight, priorities become clear. Men who once spent freely now ask whether that spending improves their lives or simply drains them. In many cases, the answer is obvious that you can see the results everywhere. Fewer dates, fewer public displays of spending, fewer men initiating conversations, fewer men tolerating disrespect. Instead of chasing approval, men are choosing self preservation. Instead of explaining themselves, they are opting out quietly. Instead of hoping things improve, they are building lives that require less from others. This shift has created anxiety because it exposes dependency that was never acknowledged. When support systems vanish, reality hits hard. Independence sounds empowering until it is tested under pressure. When bills stack up and assistance is no longer available, the narrative changes. What was once framed as empowerment now feels isolating. What was once celebrated now feels heavy. Men are not celebrating this outcome. They are simply no longer intervening to soften it. Tough times are here. The 9 to 5 is history, and the creator economy is taking over. Join Angry's Creator Academy to learn how to build a thriving online business from scratch with minimal investment. Ditch the daily grind and flourish while others falter. Plus, sign up now and get our online business blueprint free. The Academy is linked in the description below. Go check it out now. For generations, men absorbed risk and responsibility without complaint. They protected others from the harsh edges of reality. Those days are ending, not out of spite, but out of exhaustion. When you are told repeatedly that you are not needed, eventually you listen. The most important thing to understand is that this is not about revenge or punishment. It is about alignment. People align behavior with reality. Men are aligning with peace, predictability, and self respect. They are trusting what they see instead of what they are told. They are choosing observable outcomes over ideological promises. As society becomes more unstable, those who simplified their lives early are often the ones coping best. Men who reduced expenses, avoided unnecessary conflict, and focused on internal stability are finding that their choices insulated them from chaos. While others scramble to adapt, these men are already settled. This is not a call to return to old models or create new dependencies. It is an invitation to recognize cause and effect. Choices compound, narratives shape behavior, incentives drive outcomes. When systems are built on imbalance, collapse is not a surprise, it is an inevitability. We are watching the end of an era where assumptions replaced accountability, an era where expectations were enforced without reciprocity, an era where participation was demanded, but appreciation was optional. That era is over. What replaces it will depend on whether people choose reflection or denial. Men walking away are not asking for validation. They are not seeking permission. They are simply continuing forward, quietly, deliberately, on their own terms. And this is only the beginning of the conversation. What many people are struggling to accept right now is that disengagement is not the same thing as protest. Men walking away did not organize, they did not coordinate, and they did not issue demands. They simply adjusted their behavior based on lived experience. That makes this shift difficult to counter because there is no central point of pressure, no leader to negotiate with, and no narrative that can easily reverse it. When large numbers of individuals independently reach the same conclusion, the result looks sudden, even though it has been building quietly for years. For a long time, men were told that if they just tried harder, communicated better, or spent more, the outcomes would improve. Many followed that advice faithfully. They invested time, money, and emotional energy into relationships and social expectations, only to discover that effort alone does not guarantee stability or respect. Over time, repeated disappointment does something important. It teaches restraint, it teaches discernment, it teaches people to stop placing their well being in systems they do not control. One of the most overlooked aspects of the shift is how much emotional labor men were expected to perform without acknowledgement. Men were told to be emotionally available while also being emotionally restrained. They were told to listen endlessly while rarely being heard. They were told to be understanding while their own concerns were minimized. Over time, many realized that silence brought more peace than constant explanation. Walking away became less about rejection and more about relief. As this withdrawal accelerated, it exposed how much modern social dynamics relied on male initiative to function. Dating systems assumed men would approach. Social rituals assumed men would pay. Emotional safety nets assumed men would absorb stress. When those assumptions stopped holding true, confusion set in quickly. Many asked why things felt broken without examining how dependent those systems were on one sided participation. The reality is that no system survives indefinitely when the costs are concentrated on one group and the benefits are dispersed. Eventually, the group bearing the cost reduces participation. This is not ideology, it is basic human behavior. People conserve energy when returns diminish. Men are no different, they simply reach that threshold later because they were conditioned to tolerate imbalance longer. Another factor accelerating the shift is transparency. Social media, for all its flaws, allowed men to compare notes. Stories that once felt isolated suddenly appeared common. Patterns that were once dismissed as personal failure became recognizable trends. Men realized they were not uniquely flawed or unlucky. They were experiencing predictable outcomes within a flawed structure. That realization is powerful because it removes shame. When shame disappears, compliance often follows. With shame gone, men stopped internalizing blame for systems they did not design. They stopped apologizing for wanting stability. They stopped accepting narratives that framed self respect as selfishness. Instead, they began prioritizing clarity. What do I want? What does this cost me? What do I gain? If the answers did not align, they stepped back without apology. This is where storytelling matters because many public conversations mischaracterize what is happening. This is often framed as bitterness, resentment, or fear of commitment. In reality, it looks more like discernment. Many men are not avoiding relationships entirely, they are avoiding unpredictable ones. They are not rejecting connection. They are rejecting imbalance. They are not withdrawing from society. They are withdrawing from roles that demanded constant output with little return. When people talk about loneliness, it is important to separate solitude from isolation. Many men discovered that being alone does not automatically mean being lonely. In fact, constant conflict can feel far more isolating than peaceful solitude. Once men experienced control over their time and energy, many found that they were less stressed, more focused, and more content. That contentment makes external pressure less effective. Economic pressure has sharpened these choices. When money is tight, inefficiencies become intolerable. Men began asking why they were funding experiences that left them depleted. They began questioning why they were expected to subsidize lifestyles that did not include them long term. They began noticing how often generosity was assumed rather than appreciated. When financial reality hits, sentimentality fades quickly. Another element rarely discussed is risk. Legal, financial, and emotional risks associated with relationships increase significantly over time. Men were expected to assume those risks while being told they were privileged. That contradiction created cognitive dissonance that could not last forever. When people are told they have power while simultaneously bearing disproportionate consequences, eventually they stop believing the narrative. As men stepped back, they discovered something unexpected. Their lives did not collapse. In many cases, they improved. Without constant obligation, men slept better. They saved more. They focused on health. They developed skills. They pursued interest without judgment. This reinforced the decision to disengage. Once people see tangible benefits from withdrawal, returning becomes unlikely. This creates a feedback loop. As more men disengage, systems reliant on their participation strain further. As those systems strain, pressure increases on those still participating. That pressure encourages even more withdrawal. This is how slow changes suddenly appear dramatic. The tipping point is reached quietly, then noticed loudly. It is also important to note that men walking away are not a monolith. They come from different backgrounds, ages, and experiences. What they share is not ideology, but outcome. Many arrived at this place reluctantly, after years of trying to make things work. Walking away was not the first option, it was the last one. There is also a generational element here. Younger men watched older men struggle through unstable relationships, financial loss, and social judgment. They learned vicariously. They adjusted earlier. They questioned narrative sooner. They were less willing to sacrifice blindly. This generational learning accelerated the shift dramatically. At the same time, messaging that once carried authority lost credibility. When lived experience contradicts official narratives consistently, people stop listening. Men began trusting their eyes over headlines. They trusted outcomes over intentions. They trusted patterns over promises. Once that trust shifted, reversal became nearly impossible. The emotional response to the shift varies widely. Some react with curiosity and self reflection, others react with anger and denial. Calls for men to return often ignore the underlying incentives. Demands do not address why men left. Pressure does not rebuild trust. Without meaningful change, appeals fall flat. Trust is central here. Once trust erodes, rebuilding it requires time, accountability, and consistency. Many men do not see those signals yet. They see deflection instead of reflection. They see demands instead of dialogue. They see nostalgia for benefits without acknowledgement of cost. That reinforces disengagement rather than reversing it. Another overlooked aspect is how much modern life rewards minimalism. Technology reduced many needs. Entertainment, education, and community are more accessible than ever. Men realized they could build fulfilling lives with fewer dependencies. When fulfillment no longer requires constant negotiation, independence becomes attractive. This does not mean relationships are obsolete. It means standards have shifted. Men are no longer willing to enter arrangements that feel adversarial or transactional. They want cooperation, respect, and predictability. Without those elements, they choose peace. This is not radical, it is reasonable. As more men articulate these preferences openly, the cultural conversation will continue to shift. Silence is giving way to explanation, but explanation does not mean persuasion. Men are not asking others to agree. They are simply explaining why they made the choices they did. Understanding may come later, but compliance will not return automatically. The broader implication here extends beyond relationships. It reflects how people respond when institutions and norms fail to adapt. Withdrawal is a common response to misalignment. Whether in work, social life, or personal relationships, people disengage when effort feels wasted. Men walking away is one example of a larger pattern playing out across society. This moment forces uncomfortable questions. What happens when assumptions fail? What happens when incentives change? What happens when people stop doing what they were expected to do without questioning why? Those questions do not have easy answers, but ignoring them does not make them disappear. As we move forward, one thing is clear: the old script no longer works. Repeating it louder will not restore participation. Real change requires understanding why people disengaged in the first place. Until that happens, the trend will continue quietly, steadily, and without apology. Men walking away are not waiting for permission to return. They are not watching to see what happens next. They are living their lives now, focused on stability, clarity, and self respect. That is not something that can be undone with messaging alone. And that brings us to the deeper reality behind all of this. Systems do not collapse because people are cruel, they collapse because they are unsustainable. What we are witnessing is not abandonment, it is adaptation. Those who adapt early often fare better than those who resist. As the shift continues, more people will be forced to confront the gap between narrative and reality. Some will adjust, some will struggle, some will cling to the past. But the direction is set, not by ideology, but by behavior. The men are not coming back to what was, they are moving forward to what works for them, quietly, intentionally, without drama. And the conversation is far from over. As this pattern becomes more visible, a strange reversal takes place in the public conversation. The same behaviors that were once discouraged are now quietly desired again. Initiative is suddenly missed. Reliability is suddenly valuable. Stability is suddenly attractive. Yet, what is often missing from these conversations is accountability for how those traits were treated when they were freely offered. People want outcomes without revisiting the conditions that produce them. And that disconnect creates frustration on all sides. One of the hardest truths for many to face is that attraction and cooperation are shaped by environment, not entitlement. When environments reward effort, people invest effort. When environments punish effort, people withdraw it. For years, many men experienced social environments that punished initiative and framed contribution as obligation rather than choice. The natural response to that environment was not rebellion, but disengagement. People do not argue endlessly with systems that do not listen, they leave them. Another layer to the shift is how language itself changed expectations. Words like support, partnership, and equality were often used without clear definitions. In practice, these concepts frequently translated into asymmetrical responsibility. Men were expected to support without leading, provide without authority, and commit without security. Over time, the gap between language and lived reality became impossible to ignore. When words lose meaning, trust erodes. Men began asking questions that were once considered inappropriate. What am I building toward? What protections do I have? What happens if things go wrong? These questions were not signs of fear, they were signs of maturity. Mature people assess risk, mature people plan. Mature people avoid arrangements where downside is unlimited and upside is uncertain. When those questions were dismissed rather than addressed, withdrawal followed. There is also an emotional fatigue that comes from constant vigilance. Many men felt they had to monitor their words, expressions, and behavior continuously to avoid misinterpretation. That level of self surveillance is exhausting over time. When every interaction feels like a test rather than a connection, people eventually opt out. Peace becomes more valuable than participation. As men stepped away from traditional dating and relationship expectations, they also stepped away from social performance. Without the need to impress, they became more authentic. Without the need to compete, they became more grounded. This authenticity reinforced their sense of self. When identity is no longer contingent on approval, external pressure loses its grip. Another uncomfortable truth is that scarcity reveals value. When attention was abundant, it was undervalued. When effort was constant, it was assumed. Now that both are scarce, their absence is noticeable. This does not mean they will automatically return. Scarcity does not restore trust, it only highlights what was lost. The idea that men can simply be persuaded back into previous roles misunderstands human behavior. People do not return to situations that consistently harm them unless those situations change meaningfully. Apologies without action do not rebuild trust. Promises without safeguards do not reduce risk. Men are not looking for reassurance, they are looking for alignment. Alignment means expectations that match reality. Alignment means reciprocity that is consistent, not conditional. Alignment means accountability that flows in both directions. Without those elements, disengagement remains the rational choice. Men are not confused about what is being asked of them, they are clear about the cost. As economic conditions tighten further, these dynamics will intensify. Financial pressure reduces tolerance for inefficiency. Emotional pressure reduces tolerance for chaos. Social pressure loses power when survival and stability are at stake. Men who simplified their lives early will continue to weather these changes better than those who relied on external support. It is also worth noting that many men who walked away did not do so angrily. They did not harbor resentment, they simply stopped participating. This quiet exit is often misinterpreted because it lacks drama. But quiet exits are often the most permanent. They do not seek attention, they do not seek validation, they simply continue forward. Some observers interpret this as avoidance or emotional shutdown. In reality, many men report feeling more emotionally balanced than ever. Without constant conflict, their nervous systems regulate. Without constant judgment, their confidence stabilizes. Without constant obligation, their choices feel intentional rather than reactive. There is a broader cultural lesson here about how social contracts function. Social contracts are not enforced by law alone, they are sustained by mutual benefit and trust. When one side perceives that the contract no longer serves them, participation declines. This applies to work, community, and relationships alike. Ignoring this reality does not restore balance. As conversations continue, some attempt to frame men walking away as a temporary protest that will fade. This assumption underestimates the power of lived experience. Once someone experiences a life with fewer conflicts, more savings, and greater autonomy, returning to instability feels irrational. Comfort and clarity are powerful anchors. Another important aspect is that men are no longer isolated in their choices. Online communities, friendships, and shared experiences reinforce their decisions. When people see others thriving after making similar choices, confidence increases. Validation no longer needs to come from institutions that previously dismissed their concerns. This does not mean men are immune to loneliness or difficulty. It means they have chosen challenges they can manage over chaos they cannot control. They accept responsibility for their lives rather than outsourcing it to unstable systems. That acceptance brings resilience. As this shift continues, narratives will evolve. Some will attempt to moralize the situation, framing disengagement as selfishness or fear. But moral framing does not change incentives. Behavior follows outcomes, not labels. Men are not avoiding responsibility. They are choosing responsibility for themselves rather than for systems that do not reciprocate. The question many avoid asking is simple but uncomfortable. Why should someone return to a role that consistently disadvantages them? Until that question is answered honestly, nothing changes. Nostalgia does not rebuild participation, guilt does not rebuild trust, only meaningful change does. It is also important to recognize that not all men are walking away in the same way. Some withdraw completely, others remain open but selective. The common thread is discernment. Men are no longer willing to gamble blindly. They require clarity before commitment. That standard is unlikely to disappear. As society adapts to this reality, new norms will emerge. Some will adjust expectations, some will build systems that acknowledge reciprocity, others will struggle clinging to assumptions that no longer hold. Adaptation is not evenly distributed. Those who adjust early fare better. This moment also challenges deeply held beliefs about independence and interdependence. True independence requires competence and accountability. Interdependence requires trust and fairness. When either is missing, systems fracture. Men walking away are responding to fractures, not creating them. As time passes, more people will recognize that this shift did not begin with disengagement. It began with misalignment. It began when effort stopped being rewarded consistently. It began when respect became conditional. It began when accountability flowed in only one direction. Understanding this does not require agreement, it requires observation. Look at behavior, not rhetoric. Look at outcomes, not intentions. Look at patterns, not exceptions. The patterns are clear and they are not reversing on their own. Men who have found peace will protect it fiercely. Peace is hard won and easily lost. Once someone experiences a calm life built on intentional choices, they are reluctant to re enter environments defined by volatility. This is not stubbornness, it is wisdom earned through experience. As discussions continue, it is likely that more men will articulate their reasons openly. Silence will give way to explanation. Explanation will give way to normalization. What once seemed fringe will become understood as a rational response to changed conditions. The future will not look like the past. Systems that relied on unspoken obligations will need to adapt or dissolve. Those who recognize this early can adjust expectations and rebuild trust slowly. Those who deny it will continue to feel surprised by outcomes they helped create. Men walking away are not asking to be chased. They are not asking to be convinced. They are simply living differently. The world will adjust around that reality, not the other way around. And as more people come to terms with this shift, the conversation will deepen, not with accusations or demands, but with reflection. That reflection is necessary because ignoring cause and effect only delays understanding. This is not the end of relationships. It is the end of unquestioned participation. It is the end of one sided contracts. It is the beginning of discernment replacing assumption. And the story continues. As more time passes, the long term consequences of disengagement become clearer, and they reach far beyond dating or relationships alone. When a large portion of a population decides to conserve energy instead of spending it socially, entire cultural rhythms begin to change. Nightlife quiets, consumer habits shift, advertising loses effectiveness. Entire industries that depended on discretionary spending and emotional impulse feel the slowdown. This is not because people became hostile, but because priorities were reordered. When stability becomes the primary goal, excess loses appeal. One of the most revealing aspects of this moment is how many men report feeling calmer after stepping back. That calm is not accidental, it comes from removing unpredictability. When expectations are unclear, when rules change without warning, and when outcomes feel disconnected from effort, stress becomes chronic. By reducing exposure to those conditions, many men regained mental clarity. They began sleeping better, thinking more clearly, and planning more deliberately. These improvements reinforce disengagement because they are tangible and immediate. There is also a quiet dignity in choosing a life that is manageable rather than impressive. For years, many men felt pressure to perform, to display success publicly, to prove worth through spending or status. Walking away from that performance culture allowed them to redefine success privately. Success became peace, autonomy, and self direction. Once success is defined internally, external validation loses its leverage. This internal shift has another effect. Men become less reactive. When people are no longer seeking approval, criticism loses power. This is why attempts to shame men back into participation have largely failed. Shame only works when someone values the opinion of the source. When that value disappears, so does the influence. Men who walked away did not become indifferent overnight. They became selective about what they allow to affect them. Another important factor is time. Time is the one resource that cannot be replenished. As men grew older, many realized how much time they had spent navigating conflict, misunderstanding, and emotional labor with little return. That realization sharpened their priorities. They began protecting their time fiercely. When time becomes precious, people stop investing it casually. This shift has forced a reevaluation of what companionship means. Companionship that adds stress is no longer appealing. Companionship that demands constant adjustment without offering stability feels like a liability. Men are not rejecting connection. They are redefining it. They want connection that feels cooperative rather than competitive, calm rather than chaotic, supportive rather than extractive. It is also important to understand that many men did not walk away because of one bad experience. They walked away because of patterns repeated across years. Patterns shape expectations. When patterns are consistently negative, hope fades. Hope does not disappear suddenly, it erodes slowly until one day effort no longer feels justified. This erosion of hope is often misunderstood because it is quiet. There is no dramatic confrontation. There is no final argument. There is simply a decision to stop trying. From the outside, this can look like apathy. From the inside, it feels like relief. That relief is powerful and it anchors behavior. As men adjusted their lives, they discovered that simplicity has advantages. Fewer obligations mean fewer points of failure. Fewer dependencies mean greater resilience. Men learned to live within their means, both financially and emotionally. They reduced exposure to drama and focused on what they could control. This focus created stability in an unstable world. Meanwhile, those who continued relying on old assumptions felt increasing pressure. When systems built on contribution stop receiving it, strain appears quickly. Attempts to restore participation often focus on symptoms rather than causes. Calls for men to re engage rarely address why disengagement felt necessary in the first place. Without addressing that root cause, solutions remain superficial. There is also a misconception that men walking away are disengaged from society entirely. In reality, many remain active contributors in other areas. They work, build, mentor, and support causes they believe in. What they have withdrawn from are dynamics that feel misaligned. This distinction matters. Disengagement is selective, not total. As more men speak openly about their experiences, a broader cultural reckoning begins. People start questioning narratives they once accepted without scrutiny. They examine how incentives shape behavior. They reconsider assumptions about obligation and entitlement. This questioning is healthy, even if it is uncomfortable. Societies evolve when outdated ideas are challenged. Another consequence of this shift is a renewed emphasis on personal accountability. Men who walked away took responsibility for their happiness rather than outsourcing it. They stopped expecting external systems to provide fulfillment. This self reliance fostered confidence. When people believe they can meet their own needs, desperation disappears. Desperation is what often drives poor decisions. This new confidence also changes negotiation dynamics. Men are no longer willing to compromise core values for acceptance. They know what life looks like without constant negotiation, and they prefer it. This does not make them inflexible, it makes them intentional. Intentional people choose carefully, and the cultural response to this has been uneven. Some welcome the clarity and adjust expectations accordingly. Others resist, hoping pressure or messaging will reverse the trend. Resistance often manifests as confusion or frustration, but confusion does not change outcomes. Only adaptation does. As the conversation matures, it becomes clear that restoring trust is a long process. Trust requires consistency over time. It requires accountability when mistakes are made. It requires clear boundaries and mutual respect. Many men are open to rebuilding trust, but they are no longer willing to do so blindly. Caution replaces optimism. This caution is often misinterpreted as cynicism. In reality, it is informed realism. Men learned from experience. Learning does not make someone bitter, it makes them prepared. Prepared people are harder to manipulate, and that shift can feel threatening to systems that relied on predictability. There's also a demographic dimension to this shift. Men across different age groups are making similar choices for different reasons. Younger men observe older men and adjust preemptively. Older men reflect on past experiences and simplify. The result is a broad movement driven by different stages of life, but converging on similar conclusions. As these patterns solidify, new cultural norms will emerge. Expectations around dating, partnership, and contribution will change. Some will find this liberating, others will find it destabilizing. Change always produces mixed reactions, but resisting change rarely stops it. One of the most profound changes is how men now evaluate compatibility. Compatibility is no longer based on attraction alone. It includes shared values, conflict resolution styles, and long term goals. Men are less willing to ignore red flags in the hope that things will improve. Hope without evidence no longer carries weight. And this evidence based approach extends beyond relationships. Men apply it to work, friendships, and commitments. If something consistently drains energy without providing growth or stability, they reconsider it. This pragmatic mindset reflects broader societal trends toward efficiency and sustainability. It is also worth noting that this shift has not eliminated desire for companionship. It has refined it. Men want relationships that feel like partnerships, not projects. They want cooperation, not constant negotiation. They want respect that is demonstrated, not demanded. These desires are reasonable and unlikely to fade. As more people internalize these changes, conversations will become more nuanced. Instead of blame, there will be analysis. Instead of nostalgia, there will be evaluation. This is necessary for progress. Societies cannot move forward without understanding why systems fail. At its core, this moment is about alignment between effort and outcome. When effort leads to positive outcomes, people invest. When it leads to loss or stress, they withdraw. Men walking away are responding to outcomes, not ideology. That distinction is crucial. Looking ahead, the path forward depends on whether cultural systems adapt to this reality. Adaptation requires humility, honesty, and willingness to change. It requires acknowledging past imbalances and addressing them meaningfully. Without that, disengagement remains the rational choice. Men who found peace will not give it up easily. Peace becomes a baseline once experienced. Returning to volatility feels unnecessary. This does not mean men are closed off forever. It means entry standards have risen. Access now requires alignment, not pressure. As this shift continues, more people will realize that what is happening is not a rejection of connection, but a rejection of dysfunction. That distinction changes the conversation entirely. When dysfunction is removed, connection becomes possible again, but only on new terms. This is not the collapse of society, it is a recalibration. Recalibrations are uncomfortable because they disrupt expectations, but they also create opportunities for healthier systems to emerge. Whether those opportunities are taken depends on collective willingness to learn. For now, men walking away continue quietly, building lives that make sense to them. They are not waiting to be understood. They are not waiting to be validated. They are simply living with intention, and the story keeps unfolding. As this recalibration settles in, something else becomes clear. The pace of life slows down for many men, and that slowdown creates space for reflection that was previously crowded out by constant expectation. When every interaction no longer feels like a performance, people begin asking deeper questions about purpose, direction, and meaning. For many men, stepping away from chaotic dynamics opened the door to a more deliberate way of living, one where choices are made consciously rather than reactively. This deliberate approach reshapes how men evaluate risk. Risk is no longer romanticized or dismissed as something to push through for the sake of experience. Risk is measured. Risk is assessed. Risk is accepted only when the potential reward justifies the cost. This mindset extends beyond relationships into every area of life. Men become more selective about commitments, more cautious with finances, and more protective of their energy. That selectivity is not rooted in fear. It is rooted in respect for their own limits. One of the most striking changes is how men relate to conflict. In the past, many felt compelled to engage, explain, and resolve every issue, even when resolution was unlikely. Now, many choose disengagement over endless discussion. They understand that not every disagreement leads to understanding, and not every conflict is worth the emotional toll. Choosing peace over persuasion becomes a skill, and like any skill, it improves with practice. As this approach spreads, it influences social expectations in subtle ways. When fewer men chase validation, validation itself loses power. When fewer men compete for attention, attention becomes less inflated. This shift exposes how much of modern social behavior was driven by scarcity dynamics that no longer exist. When scarcity disappears, behavior changes. Another important aspect of the shift is how men redefine responsibility. Responsibility no longer means carrying burdens that are not theirs to carry. It means managing their own lives competently and ethically. It means honoring commitments they choose freely, not those imposed by pressure or guilt. This distinction is crucial because it separates genuine responsibility from obligation disguised as virtue. As men adopted this mindset, many also revisited their values. They examined which beliefs were inherited and which were chosen. They questioned narratives that no longer matched reality. This process of reassessment is uncomfortable, but it is also liberating. When people align their values with their experiences, internal conflict decreases. That alignment brings stability. This stability becomes increasingly visible as external conditions grow more uncertain. Economic fluctuations, social tension, and cultural volatility affect everyone, but those who simplified early often weather these storms better. Men who reduced unnecessary expenses, avoided volatile relationships, and focused on self sufficiency find themselves less exposed to sudden shocks. Preparedness replaces anxiety. There is also a shift in how men experience fulfillment. Fulfillment is no longer tied to external milestones or approval. It comes from mastery, progress, and self respect. Men find satisfaction in building skills, improving health, and creating routines that support long term well being. This form of fulfillment is quieter but more durable than validation based on external feedback. As fulfillment becomes internal, comparison loses relevance. Men stop measuring themselves against others and start measuring progress against their own past. This inward focus reduces envy and resentment. It also reduces susceptibility to manipulation because comparison is often the engine of pressure. Without it, many social incentives lose effectiveness. This transformation does not happen overnight. It unfolds gradually, often unnoticed by those outside it. But once established, it becomes self reinforcing. Peace encourages clarity. Clarity encourages better choices. Better choices reinforce peace. Breaking the cycle would require reintroducing chaos, and few are willing to do that voluntarily. As men become more comfortable with this way of life, their tolerance for dysfunction continues to drop. Behaviors that once seemed acceptable now stand out as unnecessary complications. This heightened awareness makes future disengagement faster and more decisive. Men no longer linger in situations hoping they will improve. They act earlier with less emotional turmoil. This has implications for how society understands motivation. Traditional models assume that pressure and expectation drive participation. What we are seeing now suggests that autonomy and alignment are far more powerful motivators. When people feel respected and secure, they engage willingly. When they feel exploited or dismissed, they withdraw. The resistance to this idea often comes from fear of losing control. Systems that relied on pressure struggle to adapt to autonomy. But autonomy does not mean chaos. It means voluntary participation based on mutual benefit. Systems built on that foundation tend to be more resilient. As conversations around this shift deepen, language begins to change. Instead of talking about obligation, people talk about choice. Instead of entitlement, they talk about contribution. Instead of blame, they talk about incentives. This shift in language reflects a deeper shift in thinking. When thinking changes, behavior follows. It is also important to acknowledge that disengagement creates space for growth in unexpected areas. Many men reconnect with creativity, learning, and community in new ways. They invest in friendships that feel reciprocal. They mentor younger men. They contribute where they feel valued. This selective engagement strengthens social bonds rather than weakening them. The idea that men walking away are isolating themselves completely misses this nuance. And isolation is not the goal. Selectivity is. Men are not rejecting connection, they are curating it. They choose environments where their presence is appreciated and their boundaries respected. This curation leads to healthier interactions overall. As this approach becomes more common, it challenges traditional power dynamics. Influence shifts from those who demand participation to those who earn it. Respect becomes something demonstrated through action rather than assumed through position. This shift can feel destabilizing to established structures, but it is also an opportunity for renewal. Renewal requires honesty. It requires acknowledging where systems failed and why. It requires listening without defensiveness. It requires change that goes beyond surface level messaging. Without these elements, disengagement remains the default response. Men are not asking for perfection, they are asking for fairness. They are asking for predictability. They are asking for respect that is mutual, not conditional. These are reasonable expectations in any cooperative system. As time goes on, those who adapt to this reality will find new forms of collaboration and connection. Those who resist will continue to feel frustration and confusion. Adaptation is not about conceding power, it is about recognizing reality. The most enduring lesson from this shift is simple. People invest where they feel valued, they withdraw where they feel exploited. This principle applies universally, regardless of gender, culture, or context. Ignoring it leads to decline. Respecting it leads to sustainability. Being said, and men walking away are living proof of this principle in action. They did not set out to change the system. They changed their behavior in response to it. The system is now responding in turn. As this cycle continues, the focus will increasingly turn to building environments that encourage voluntary participation. This is the only path forward that restores balance without coercion. Anything else simply accelerates withdrawal. For now, men continue to choose clarity over confusion, peace over pressure, and intention over inertia. They are not waiting for permission. They are not asking for approval. They are simply living in alignment with what they have learned. And as more people begin to understand this, the conversation will shift again. Not toward conflict, but toward reconstruction. That reconstruction will be slow, deliberate, and grounded in reality. The recalibration continues, one quiet decision at a time. As we reach the final stretch of this discussion, it is important to step back and look at the full arc of what has unfolded. What began as individual decisions made quietly has matured into a broad cultural adjustment. This adjustment was not planned, promoted, or coordinated. It emerged organically from experience. When enough people encounter the same outcomes repeatedly, behavior changes. That is what we are witnessing now. And understanding that reality is essential if there's going to be any meaningful path forward. For many men, the most significant change has been internal. They no longer define themselves by how much they give to others or how much approval they receive in return. They define themselves by competence, stability, and self direction. This internal anchor makes them far less susceptible to pressure, guilt, or external judgment. When identity is rooted internally, external narratives lose their ability to control behavior. This internal grounding also alters how men approach the future. Instead of planning their lives around expectations placed on them, they plan around what is sustainable. Sustainability becomes the key metric. Can this lifestyle be maintained without constant stress? Can this arrangement function without ongoing conflict? Can this commitment endure without sacrificing personal well being? If the answer is no, men are increasingly comfortable walking away early rather than enduring long term damage. That comfort with early exit is often misunderstood. It is not avoidance, it is prevention. It reflects a deeper understanding of cause and effect. When people recognize patterns quickly, they do not wait for outcomes to worsen before acting. This proactive mindset saves time, energy, and emotional resources. It is one of the clearest signs of maturity. Another outcome of this shift is how men now view compromise. Compromise is no longer seen as inherently virtuous. It is evaluated based on balance. Compromise that benefits both parties is welcome. Compromise that consistently disadvantages one side is rejected. This distinction restores the original meaning of partnership, which is cooperation, not concession. As men adopted this framework, they became less reactive to criticism. Criticism without constructive intent is no longer internalized. Opinions that do not align with lived experience are dismissed rather than debated. This does not mean men stopped listening. It means they became selective about whose input they value. Selectivity is a natural response to information overload and conflicting narratives. This selectivity also applies to media consumption. Many men stepped back from content that amplifies anxiety or resentment and gravitated toward content that promotes clarity and self improvement. This shift reduces emotional volatility and reinforces stability. When people control their inputs, they gain control over their outputs. As stability increases, fear decreases. Fear is often the driver of poor decisions. When fear subsides, people make choices based on logic rather than urgency. Men who have reduced fear in their lives through simplification and self reliance find themselves less vulnerable to manipulation. This resilience is one of the most overlooked consequences of disengagement. It is also important to acknowledge that the shift does not eliminate challenges. Life remains complex, economic pressure remains real, uncertainty remains part of the human experience. The difference is that men who have recalibrated face these challenges with clearer boundaries and fewer unnecessary complications. They carry what is theirs to carry and leave the rest behind. This clarity reshapes expectations around intimacy and connection. Men are no longer willing to rush into arrangements without understanding long term implications. They value transparency over intensity. They prioritize emotional safety over excitement. This does not mean passion disappears. It means passion is balanced with prudence. As this balance becomes more common, relationships that do form are often more stable. When entry standards are higher, compatibility improves. When people choose each other deliberately rather than by default, cooperation becomes easier. These relationships may be fewer in number, but they are often stronger in foundation. The broader social impact of this shift will continue to unfold over time. institutions, industries, and cultural norms will either adapt or struggle. Adaptation requires acknowledging that participation is voluntary, not guaranteed. It requires creating environments where people want to engage, not where they feel compelled to do so. This moment also invites reflection on how narratives are created and sustained. Narratives that ignore lived experience eventually collapse. Reality always asserts itself. When people are encouraged to ignore what they see and feel, trust erodes. Restoring trust requires aligning narratives with reality, not dismissing reality to protect narratives. Men walking away have already aligned their behavior with reality. They are not waiting for consensus. They are not seeking permission. They are simply living according to what works. That autonomy is powerful, and it will continue shaping outcomes regardless of how it is labeled. As more people recognize this, the tone of the conversation may shift again. There may be less accusation and more inquiry, less blame and more analysis. That shift would be healthy because understanding requires curiosity, not condemnation. One of the most constructive outcomes of this recalibration is the renewed emphasis on mutual respect. Respect is no longer assumed, it is demonstrated through behavior. When respect flows in both directions, engagement follows naturally. When it does not, disengagement remains the rational response. This principle applies universally. It is not limited to relationships. It applies to workplaces, communities, and institutions. People invest where they feel respected and withdraw where they do not. Ignoring this truth leads to decline. Embracing it leads to resilience. Men who have found peace are unlikely to abandon it lightly. Peace becomes a standard, not a luxury. Any future engagement must meet that standard. This does not mean men are closed off. It means they are discerning. Discerning people build better lives over time. As we look ahead, it is clear that the old assumptions no longer hold. Participation can no longer be taken for granted. Effort must be reciprocated. Stability must be valued. These are not radical ideas. They are foundational principles that were neglected for too long. The recalibration we are witnessing is not about loss. It is about correction. Corrections are uncomfortable, but they are necessary for long-term health. Systems that refuse to correct eventually fail completely. Systems that adapt survive. Men walking away are not celebrating collapse. They are adapting to change. They are choosing lives that are sustainable, intentional, and aligned with reality. That choice deserves understanding, even if it challenges existing beliefs. As this conversation comes to a close, it is worth asking what lessons can be carried forward. One lesson is that autonomy matters. Another is that incentives shape behavior. Another is that peace is not weakness. Like, these lessons apply far beyond this topic. If you have been listening closely, you may recognize elements of your own experience reflected here. That recognition is not accidental. These patterns are widespread because the conditions that created them were widespread. Understanding that can reduce confusion and replace it with clarity. I want to hear what you think about what was discussed today. Do you agree with these observations? Do you see similar patterns playing out around you? Leave a comment and share your thoughts, because this conversation is bigger than any one voice. Like the video, if you like it, don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.